Hello and welcome to Inside Music, episode number 162. I'm your host, James Shotwell, and it's great to be with you again. I do not have a guest on the show this week, and let me tell you why. I was recently watching an episode of Gary Vaynerchuk, or Gary V's show on Instagram, which I know is a weird sentence in the year 2019, but that's where I was watching him. And he had somebody come up and he said, "Hey, I run a channel about something or another. And when I don't have a guest or when things that I'm trying to do don't work out, I sometimes just don't post content." And Gary said that that's a horrible way to approach your business. You should always be sharing content. And if the thing that you're trying to do doesn't work out, maybe what you should do instead is share an original story, or maybe the story about how that thing didn't come together, and just keep the content coming. Always be giving your audience something else. So I didn't want to leave you guys without an episode this week. We had a guest scheduled to be on the show, and due to how the industry goes, they just weren't able to make their appearance, and that's perfectly fine. No hard feelings. I'm sure they'll be on in the future, but I didn't want to go a week without doing Inside Music because you've been very loyal to me as of late, and or maybe always if you're a long-term listener, and I just wanted to give you something else. So what we're going to do today is a little different. I've been doing this for 5 years now. I've been working in music full-time for the better part of a decade, and only very early on did I take the time to tell you about myself, who I am, where I come from, how this show came to be, and what it is that I actually do for a living, how I pay my bills, how I feed my cats, so on and so forth. So this episode of Inside Music is just going to be me telling you my story about how I made it in the music industry, how you can maybe do it yourself, and really just who I am, because sometimes I feel like people discover the show, they come here to hear their favorite artist be interviewed or hear somebody that they might know be interviewed, and they don't always know who I am. So this episode will hopefully solve that problem. I'm already tripping over my words. This is off to a great start. But that's what we're going to do. So without further ado, let's get into the rest of the introduction. This episode of Inside Music and all episodes of Inside Music are brought to you by Holix, the music industry's leading promotional distribution platform. Now, what that means is that Holix works with record labels, independent artists, and publicists from all over the world to discreetly share new and unreleased music. To learn how they do that and gain access to a free 30-day trial, visit Holix.com. That's HAULIX.com. You should also be following the company on Twitter. It's at Holix, HAULIX. There you can find information about this show, the company, and guides and tutorials about making it and surviving the music industry today. I write tons of content for this site. I also do this show, as well as run a YouTube channel. So please seek it all out, enjoy it, consume it, and learn a little bit more about this crazy thing we call entertainment. Finally, I have nothing to promote myself because this is what I do. I do this show. So we're just going to go ahead and play the song, and then I'm going to be back telling you about my journey in the music industry. Thank you so much for listening. Enjoy the show. So let's just get right into it. My name is James Shotwell, and I am from Southwest Michigan. I went to my first concert when I was about 3 or 4 years old. I attended a ton of shows growing up. My family, neither of them work in music, but my parents both love it incredibly. They still go to shows today. They're still married, and my entire childhood was pretty much based around music. If we weren't listening to it in the car or at home, we were going to a show, and a lot of it, to be honest with you, was Christian music, alternative Christian music, to be a little bit more specific. I grew up in a heavily religious household, and it wasn't until I was in my teens that I was even able to own what we call secular music or non-Christian music. My dad did have a few albums of that sort. We listened to a lot of ABBA, Bob Seger, the classics of pop and rock music. But in terms of what was actually happening in the early 90s and late 80s, it was kind of outside of my peripherals. I didn't really know what was going on necessarily, but that was fine because I had a ton of artists that I loved and would listen to endlessly nonetheless. When I was 9 years old, we moved to Michigan, Southwest Michigan to be specific, this tiny town called Constantine, from Ohio, where I was born. And when we got there, literally about 2 months later, a venue opened in the town, which is kind of incredible because Constantine is a town of less than 3,000 people. But some people had come together and raised the money to open a small venue. And on New Year's Eve of that year, we went to a show at the venue with this ska band called Buck, and we just had a great time. It was me, my mom, and dad, and surrounded by all these teenagers who were several years older than me at the time, but who would later become my closest friends. The venue was open for about a year or two before it went under, and I missed it. It left this hole in my life because live music had always been a part of our world. But when that venue closed, and it was called the Apocalypse, when the Apocalypse closed, we kind of didn't have anywhere to go for live music. We could drive to Grand Rapids or Kalamazoo, some of the bigger towns in Michigan, but that was kind of a big undertaking for us, especially because we didn't have a ton of money. But when I was in middle school, I was in civics class, I believe, and a teacher informed us about how every town has a budget and people can always go to the town and suggest ways that they spend the money. And so I got into looking at the Constantine records, and I found that our city had an annual budget of $25,000 set aside for entertainment, which is kind of crazy because we're in a town of less than 3,000 people. And up until that point, there weren't really a lot of events going on. We didn't have a county fair. We didn't have anything that would justify spending $25,000 that I knew of. So I got the paperwork together and I petitioned the town to give me $5,000 to help me reopen the Apocalypse. Now, I did this with the full cooperation of the family that owned the property and owned the building, which, as I learned, had been just sitting empty. All the equipment was still there, but there were no shows because they didn't have the money to keep the lights on. So I got $5,000 so that I could open the venue and start putting on shows again. And the town, for whatever reason, approved the measure. So the money came to me, I gave it to the family, and they, for reasons that I still do not fully understand, allowed me to book shows at the age of 14. So what did I do? I turned to my closest friends. I had friends in bands at that point. Most of them were probably terrible in hindsight, but we put on shows and kids from the school would come out and people would get dressed up. They would act like it was, something really, really special because they'd never been to a rock and roll show before. And here in our tiny town, there were rock shows. And after those first couple of events, which were popular because no one had ever gone to a rock show in our area before, I stretched my legs a bit and started inviting touring bands that my friends had met through their other gigs. And most of them were Christian acts, but there were a few non-Christian acts that came through that really kind of kicked the doors open into what would become my career in alternative music. Well, an early act was Every Avenue, who is no longer together, but for a while were on Fearless Records. Another one was Hit the Lights from Ohio, who were on Triple Crown Records and put out a bunch of albums that people still cherish today in the world of pop punk. And then, of course, there were a lot of bands that never went anywhere, but we had a lot of fun. We made a lot of memories, and that kind of kept me engaged in music. A couple of years later, when I was 16, I got handed a sampler in a church parking lot for an album from Atreyu called The Curse, and it was one of these Victory Records CD samplers. And for the younger listeners, you might not remember this period, but everyone else will. There was an era in alternative music where every label would just put out CD samplers every few months that would showcase all their new artists, and this Victory Records one really captivated me. But instead of just falling in love with the bands, which I absolutely did, I also fell in love with the idea of promoting the music that I love through other shows and gigs and just extending my kind of presence in the music industry. So I reached out to Victory Records. At the time, there was a man there named Mark Bubb, who is not working in music anymore. But Mark worked with me to get into the street team world and to start promoting Victory Records. And from that point forward, from 16 until about 22, every couple of months, boxes of 300 or 500 sampler CDs would come to my parents' house, and I would pick them up or to my college dorm, and I would just hand them out to everybody that I knew. I was literally buried in CD samplers, but it was something that I loved to do because I believed in the bands, I believed in the label at the time, and I felt like I was really a part of something. And I think that when you're growing up, it's so important to feel like you're a part of something. And at first I had the Apocalypse, and now I had this thing with Victory Records. But then college comes. And right before I left college, just to kind of book in the story here, I held one final show for the Apocalypse. We did it outside. It was an all-day music festival. There were 12 bands over 8 hours, and it did not go well. It was a soft end to what should have been a big triumphant thing in my brain. But we still had a lot of fun. Once again, we put on the show that I wanted to put on, and we had a lot of fun doing it. So then I go to college, and I've left the small town. I'm going to Ferris State University. It's one of the top music business schools in the world, which at the time I thought was the perfect way to get a job in music. And all I wanted to do was work at Victory Records in Chicago, because remember, I'd been on their street team for several years now. I felt a very close kinship with the people that work there that I knew, as well as the artists that I would help promote and sometimes see on tour. College was not what I expected, however. I quickly realized that as much as I would be able to learn about the music business during 1 or 2 courses every semester, the bulk of my time was spent studying the same things I was studying in high school, science and math, and a lot of just classes that were unrelated to what I ultimately wanted to do in the world of business. And even the business classes were not really geared towards people who wanted to work in entertainment as much as they were people who wanted to work in factories or who wanted to oversee large teams within factories. It just wasn't what I wanted. But the thing that college did provide me was an opportunity to do 2 things. One was join college radio, which was absolutely free, and it gave me the opportunity to share my love of music with more people through the airwaves. And the second one was that it provided me a lot of free time to do what I want. And when I was 20 years old, I was sitting on Facebook, as we all do sometimes, and I found a listing from somebody saying that their friend was starting a music website and they needed someone to review albums. And that really captivated my imagination. Up until then, I didn't understand how someone wrote about music. How did you become an authority in music? And here it was, an opportunity to start talking about music despite not really having any authority myself. So I reached out, and the guy who ran a website that no longer exists called High Beam Review replied to me and gave me my first album to review. And from there, it just became a thing that I did. I would stay up all night in my dorm room typing away, writing these long, and I mean 1,000-word plus reviews about albums that other people would probably spend 30 seconds talking about. But I made it my entire world. I just fell in love with the craft. And it wasn't always something that went smoothly. I remember very specifically early on that I gave a negative review to the band The Black Dahlia Murder, and I got a pretty angry letter from the people that represented him. And in hindsight, I now realize that it's because I definitely did not know what I was talking about. I was just rambling about a band that didn't really suit my interests, and I wasn't recognizing who they were or what they were doing as musicians, and that fell on me. But anyways, I write at High Beam for a while until I read this book from Abby Hoffman, this prolific free thinker from the 60s and 70s, who had a book called Steal This Book, and all it was ways to get free things in the world. And one of the chapters was all about music. In it said that if you wanted to get free music, all you had to do was start your own publication. And in the 70s, you didn't even actually have to start the magazine. There was no internet. There was no way for anyone to follow up. So he suggested making a mock-up magazine, taking it to Kinko's, getting a bunch of photocopies, and then sending it off to record labels as a sample of your work, and then they would put you on their mailing lists, and you would start receiving free music. I tried to adapt that to the modern age. So I started my own website. It was called Under the Gun Review, along with my friends, with a lot of help from my friends, I should say. And we launched in 2008, March 15th, 2008, using $10 I borrowed from my parents because I was a broke college kid. And we started writing about music. And who would have guessed Abby Hoffman's advice, about 40 years after it was written, still held true. I started telling publicists that I ran this music website and I was writing about bands and I would love to cover their bands. And all the artists that I loved, which admittedly were small to mid-level artists, started sending me music. I started getting free copies of albums months in advance, and it always felt like it was like I was a person in a room I wasn't supposed to be in and nobody had recognized it yet. I always felt like I was getting away with something, and in a lot of ways I still feel that way today. But anyways, as we were moving forward in the site, I started to get my friends to become what I like to call staff members or team members. I partnered with my buddy Grant, my buddy Justin or JP, and then we started branching out to people that we didn't actually know in real life. There's this young man named Jacob Tender, who we found online, whose writing we adored, and we asked him to come along, and he was the first person to really take us in a more professional direction, who would organize things and build things and help us set ourselves apart with branding. And even though the site wasn't the biggest thing in the world, we really felt like we were onto something special. We felt like we were doing something that nobody had ever done before, and that it was going to be the rest of our lives. A couple years after that, while we were still in college, we were approached by a company called Buzz Media, who had also talked to a fellow sites, Property of Zach and Absolute Punk, and some others to talk about maybe bringing all of our sites together in a partnership they wanted to call Absolute Voices. And they put a bunch of money in front of us, sent us contracts, and said, you give us your website, we'll sell ads for you. You'll make money right now, and you'll make money in perpetuity for the next several years, and you get to keep creative control of your website. Obviously, being a broke college kid, that seemed like the perfect opportunity, and with graduation quickly approaching, we decided to go for it. The problem was that never really came to fruition. The idea of Absolute Voices was that all these sites were going to work together to become the dominant force in the world of alternative music, and that they were going to have this endless support from the Buzz Media staff and team in LA. And I have no doubts that they were absolutely sincere in wanting to make that reality happen, but in actually doing it, it just never came together. So the site continued to exist, and after a lot of back and forth, we eventually got our sites back, but we never really saw any of the money that was promised to us, and slowly that dream of becoming a blogger faded into the distance. But along the way, I had done some other things in college. I had taken an internship with a company called the Planetary Group, which was one of the many PR firms that I worked with regularly through Under the Gun Review, and they offered me to spend a summer in Boston. So I went to Boston, and I'm out there doing my internship, and 2 weeks into it, word comes down from their boss that the company is going out of business. So right now, I find myself in a position where the website that I'm working for, that dream is no longer viable necessarily, and my internship, which is often how college students find their first job, isn't really going to go anywhere because that company is going out of business, and everyone in the office is now scrambling to find their own work. So here I am, turning 22, getting out of college, and I don't have the next thing I'm going to do. I'm still doing Under the Gun. It's still a website that I'm running, but I don't really have anything going on in my life that's going to turn into money anytime soon. So I take a couple of jobs in the greater West Michigan area doing things that are related to what I did in college, marketing jobs, and it's just not working out. A friend gives me a tip about an opening at Hot Topic of all places, something that I am suited to do because I like all the music that they sell, and I get to be a manager at Hot Topic for a few months, and I absolutely hate it. It's just not for me. But it does pay my bills long enough for a friend in Boston who wrote for Under the Gun to tell me that the company they work for, this music startup called Our Stage, was looking for more people for their team and had a paid internship opportunity that would get me out of Michigan into a major city and back into the music industry. So I apply. I tell them that I've been working with this individual. They had written for me at a website, and they fly me out to do a proper interview. Now, this is a job that offered $10 an hour for 30 hours a week, but it was something in the music business. It was something that was within the realm of my dream, and thankfully I had people in Boston who were willing to let me live with them until I could get on my feet. So I flew out there, and I did it. The interview went well. I came home, and then 2 weeks went by, and then 3 weeks, and then 4 weeks, and I'm just living my life trying to get by, and a phone call comes, and they say, hey, we don't want to give you the internship, but we do want to know if you'd like to join our team as a marketing manager. It was a dream come true for me at that time. They offered me a reasonable amount of money, and I drove out to Boston about 5 days later to start my new career at ourstage.com. It was a cool job at first. There was a lot of money coming in, funding from investors, and we were building this software that would allow people to not only book shows online, but also run contests where people could win things like opening for Drake on tour. And along the way, I got to make marketing materials for all this, but I also got to meet a lot of venues in the New England area, as well as a ton of artists, and just develop cool content and cool ideas to talk about music in a way that I had never done before, but that very much played into my interests. The problem is, the goal of the software, much like the goal of Absolute Voices several years prior, was never really fully realized. We never had a complete product that did everything that we wanted it to do, and because of that, the company started to have problems getting additional funding. So here I am, living in Boston, trying to pay my bills, and we start missing paydays. And the company isn't just not paying us, they just literally don't have the money to pay us. So they do this thing called furlough, where you continue to work, but you're not getting paid. And after a little while, they would give you the money, and sometimes they wouldn't give you all the money they owed you. They would just give you a little bit of money, and then people started to leave and other people got fired, and it just became this very difficult time in my life where I didn't really know where I was going to go in the future. I definitely didn't know how long this runway at our stage would last, but I didn't have any other options. So I just stuck with it. I just stayed on the path I was on and I just trusted in myself. And all the while, I am still writing, I am still blogging, I'm still just getting my creativity out of my head, but that's not really bringing in any money. And I can't rely on our stage. Thankfully, the company did a gigantic partnership with Warped Tour that put about 25 artists on the tour over the course of one summer in 2012. And I got to be the person that not only led that project from a marketing standpoint, but I also went out with the bands and served as tour manager. I rode on a bus. We went to all the cities. We rubbed shoulders with our alternative peers. And we really got to experience that area of the industry, that kind of having made it one step higher than where we all were on the ladder of success. And it was a crazy summer because I met all of my heroes and I got to do something that I always dreamed of, working on Vans Warped Tour. It was a great time, but even when I was on that tour, 4 weeks passed before a paycheck would come in. And so I was just out there broke, trying to figure out what was going to happen next, what was going to happen when I got home. What did happen is that I get home and the company says, we've cut all the employees. What used to be like a 60-person team is now 12. And now we're going to sell our office space. So we sell our office and we move to a new office. And I end up in a room that is 10 by 10 or smaller with one other individual that has no windows. And we're there for 8 hours a day, tinkering away at a website and a project that we both know subconsciously is not going to become the thing that we wanted to. And the whole time we had hope. Every day we would sit in our office and we would talk to each other about how if this thing happened or if this falls into place, things will start to turn around. But we also knew that probably wasn't going to happen. And I had really started to reach my wit's end when a miracle occurred. I was sitting at my desk one day listening to a new album that was not yet released, and I saw that it was from this company called Holix, which I had been using for years to listen to unreleased music. And I had the idea to tweet at them and ask them how they did their marketing. How did you promote a business that deals kind of in secrecy? And so I sent a tweet and I asked, and this company wrote back and said, well, do you have any ideas? Could you email us? And I sent an email with a couple of ideas on how the company could better themselves. And what I learned is that they didn't have a marketing person at the time. The founder and owner, Matt Brown, had been doing everything himself, and he was looking to bring someone onto the team. So even though I was still working at our stage, I took on 20 hours a week working with Holix. And I could do this job remotely, which meant I could work from home, stay in Boston, not have to move, and just do both things at once, which was admittedly a lot of work, but it was guaranteed money and an opportunity to do what I loved above all else, which was talk to people about music and create content. So I start doing that for a couple of months, and then Holix likes what I'm doing so much that they offer me a full-time position. I quit our stage altogether, and I go full in on Holix, still working remotely, still having not actually met my boss, and just living every day wondering how long this weird dream that I was in could continue. Because, I mean, how perfect is that? You get to stay at home every day. You get to make almost exactly what you want to make for a living, and you don't have to report to anyone directly. Like, there's no one hanging over your head watching what you're doing. You're in it. You're responsible for yourself and for the company's success. And as long as you continue to do the things that bring success, you can do whatever it is that you want to do. It's perfect. And that's where I am till to this day. So after about a year of being in Boston, Matt offered to have me fly out to Minnesota so that I could meet him and talk to him about possibly moving there. I went, we had a great time, and sure enough, a couple months later, he bumped me up to full-time at Holix, and I moved out to Minnesota to work on the company. We had an office space, and it was pretty incredible, at least for the year. I had some things happen in my personal life that completely changed my outlook on things, but through it all, I continued to work at Holix, and while I was there, I decided that we should have a podcast. It was one of the very first ideas that I pitched because podcasts were still an emerging thing at the time, and I thought that we could get in on the ground floor. And Matt didn't really know what they were, but he gave me the opportunity to do it, and here we are right now, talking on Inside Music episode number 162. 162. It's just crazy to me that we're still doing this show and that you're all here listening to me now. And if you've made it this far into the episode, you're a real champ. But let me tell you some of the big takeaways from my journey in the music industry. First and foremost, there is no right or wrong path. People chase their passion in whatever way that they can, and they hope that it works out. For some, it works out way better than it does for others. But for most of us, we never become, the headliners that stand on stage in front of 50,000 people. Some of us never want to be that, but we want to be that in our own way. We want to be the head of a giant company. We want to be successful in a way that we never thought imaginable. But the thing is, real success, and what I've found, and from all the people that I talk to who have succeeded to various levels, real success comes from getting to kind of choose what you do each day. And whether that means creating something new every day, whether that means engaging with people in a way that's, unique to your voice. Real success is waking up every day feeling excited about what you get to do, because you get to determine your fate. You get to choose what that thing is that you do. And if you can get there, then you've already won the game of life, at least from a professional perspective. Because any other option where you're just working for somebody else, doing something that you don't want to be doing, that takes up the majority of your time here on this earth. We all work 40 hours a week, or we're trying to work full time at 40 hours a week. And if you're spending 40 hours of your week doing something you hate, it's just terrible. And I feel very fortunate to be where I am today. And I've only gotten there because of people like you listening right now, giving a damn about the things that I do. So I thank you so much for that. And I promise that we will have new exciting episodes of Inside Music to come in the very near future. But for now, I'm going to get back to work. I have a lot of writing to do this week, and I have my annual review here at Holics on Friday. I'm celebrating 6 years with the company, and I'm looking forward to many more. So again, thank you so much for listening. Have a great week.